There are certain mistakes that are commonly made in history exams and formal assessments, and it's important for us as teachers to know what these common mistakes are and how to guide our learners through them. The first common mistake is that learners don't demonstrate a level of understanding. So let's see where learners struggle. Often learners don't read the question correctly, and sometimes they don't identify what sort of answer is actually required. Often learners do not answer the question at the correct cognitive level and tend to regurgitate facts rather than show understanding. Let's have a look at some examples. In this particular example, learners lack the necessary skills to discuss the different forms of protest that the civil rights activists embarked on. Most learners gave a narrative account of the actual protest action. In this example, learners tended to only provide information about the TRC and failed to use the relevant examples to substitute their answer. Now, how do we help our learners? Well, the first is we have to emphasize the importance of both factual knowledge and the application of this knowledge to both their scenarios and their examples. We need to discourage the regurgitation of facts. We need to expose the learners to a variety of different questions and coach them to approach these different questions correctly. But most importantly, we need to provide our learners with a list of keywords and explain to them what each of these mean. So, for example, if they get in the exam paper, compare, distinguish, evaluate, justify, they know what is expected of them and what these terms mean. The next mistake often made by learners is that they don't plan their answers. Often learners don't take the time to plan before they actually write down the answer. Let's have a look at an example. Most learners struggle to provide a logical and well-prepared argument, so often learners fail to include an introduction and/or conclusion. The next example is slightly different, as this question has layers to it, and it needs to be planned and organized in order to answer the question. Many learners fail to plan their response, and this results in learners not focusing on the actual question. In the third example, the learners failed to answer the question as they wrote about the conflict in Angola rather than how Cuba became involved in the actual war. Often sentences were disjointed and illogical. Once again, learners need to plan. Now, how do we help our learners? Well, the most important thing is to emphasize the importance of planning, particularly so that they avoid repetition and that they actually answer the question correctly. The second is to demonstrate to learners how to structure an effective answer. And then most importantly, make sure the learners understand the use and the importance of headings and subheadings. One of the things we can emphasize to the learners is they must ensure their essays have introductions, main bodies, and conclusions. And even more so, when they're writing their essays, they must make sure that they have a planned and constructed argument, that they've got evidence to support their argument, and then most importantly, that they reach a conclusion based on this evidence. The third common mistake made in the history exam is poor evaluation of sources. Learners often demonstrate a poor understanding of the source. They struggle to interpret cartoons, and even more so, they fail to identify bias and the accuracy of the source. In this example, learners struggled with the term biased and failed to actually find evidence to suggest bias was evident. The next example, learners struggled to understand the question and to formulate an opinion and justify it. This happens often in the history exam. In the next question, which often happens with photographs and cartoons and so on, the learners struggle to identify the answer that the question is actually requiring. The message of the photograph is not linked to the civil war in Angola in this particular case. And then the fourth example, the learners struggle to assimilate information selected from the source and their own knowledge into a coherent comment. Now, how can we help and guide our learners? Well, the first is we must make sure our learners are familiar with wording in questions. And once again, as we said earlier, provide them with this list of words so they know what is expected of them. Learners need to practice extracting information from the source. And we also need to emphasize the importance of using the source to substantiate their own opinion or comment. And most importantly, learners must be guided into how to answer questions that require comparisons, making judgments, interpreting, and analyzing. And then the fourth common mistake is that learners aren't able to distinguish between content. Often learners give irrelevant content in answer and they get confused between different concepts and terminology. Example of these include the first one, where many learners lack the necessary content to answer the actual question. Most learners wrote on how the process of negotiations was disrupted. They were unable to explain how the right-winged groups attempted to disrupt the negotiations. The next example, learners were unable to show their understanding of the topic and their answers. Many lacked the necessary content knowledge to discuss what extent Angola was able to reimagine itself. And then in the third example, learners failed to focus on the topic and demonstrated a very weak historical knowledge on the topic. There was very little synthesis of sources with content knowledge, and learners didn't actually answer the question required. Of course, the learners lose lots of marks through this, so we want to make sure that they answer what is required and at the right level as well. So how do we help the learners? Well, the first is emphasize the importance of understanding the facts and not just learning them off by heart. Emphasize the importance of reading the question carefully. Provide suitable examples in class of difficult concepts so the learners are easily able to distinguish between the terminology, and they get used to this every day during class. And most importantly, support the learners in identifying the appropriate factual information to support their answer, so that they're able to do this and then they're able to support it. These 4 common mistakes happen often in the history exam and in history formal assessment. Please make sure that you guide the learners appropriately and correctly to prevent these common mistakes from happening, and then of course for them to raise their results.